Hello, welcome to this interview with John Vervaeke. John Vervaeke is a cognitive scientist and he has become well known on YouTube for his series on the meaning crisis. He is also, as we discovered in the early part of the interview, a lifelong fan of science fiction. And we explore the areas that science fiction and the meaning crisis overlap. It's a fantastic dialogue out of which came a real insight into the ways that science fiction can help us to grow and to heal. It's really, really something quite special. I really hope that you enjoy it. This interview is sponsored by the Advanced course in Science Fiction and Fantasy Writing, the 21st Century Myth. The interview is also part of the course. You can join in and help us find the new myths for the 21st century and write your own great science fiction and fantasy stories. You can find the course on all good educational platforms, and you can find it on my own website. Thank you very much. So hello, John. Thank you for taking the time to talk to me. I've invited you to come and talk to me about science fiction for an online course that I run. Right. So I would describe myself as primarily a writer and storyteller. And I do that for my own stories, and I work quite a lot in the business and corporate sector as well. And also through my career as, I guess, like an independent researcher into storytelling and with a specialization in science fiction, covering things like so sci-fi, fantasy, horror, all of these kind of related areas. There's an academic called John Clute who calls them Fantastica because they all have this shared aspect of
That's cool.
Reality. Yeah,
I like that name. That's great. Yeah. It sounds like a place you should travel to.
Well, in England, the joke is that it's a really good curry, a fantastic tikka. So, and I have been totally fascinated. I'm actually having one of those fan moments because I've spent literally, I guess, probably not quite hundreds of hours, but 20s or 50s of hours watching your whole course in tackling the meaning crisis. So I'm very used. I know a lot about you, and I'm very used to watching you on my laptop screen. And now here we are talking.
Yeah, that experience has become more common for me. I'll meet people who will say exactly the same sort of thing that you're saying, and it's a very challenging experience for me because I'm by nature very socially phobic, and so this sense of people knowing me much more than I know them when I meet them is always a little bit like there's parts I have to have this extra level of processing I've sort of trained myself to have to sort of like, oh, okay, and just sort of try and adapt into it. Thank you for saying that. I shouldn't be complaining. Thank you for saying that. It's very appreciative. I really do appreciate the interest and support a lot of people are taking in my work. It means a lot to me.
Well, it was a really important thing to discover for me because and this is what I kind of want to go into in talking together. The idea of the meaning crisis really opened up lots of thoughts for me about, my own life for a start, and that I'm personally struggling with this idea of a meaning crisis. And that I feel that I found through my life, like some kind of answer to the meaning crisis or a sense of an answer in science fiction and fantasy.
Right. Yeah.
And these kind of escapist literatures. So I'm kind of, I guess I feel like I'm coming to you to find some kind of wisdom to see if there's some kind of overlap between these ideas.
Very much. I think there is.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot. I think one thing I should say right off the bat is I'm also a very significant science fiction and fantasy fan. I read a lot. I read a lot of that literature, and I've read it for very. I basically from New Wave on, I was reading science fiction very deeply, and it's actually had a profound influence on me. And in connection with horror, the book that I wrote with Christopher Massapietro and Philip Misevic on the meaning crisis actually was it's the title of the book there, zombies. It's about the zombie phenomena as a cultural mythology for expressing the meaning crisis. So we propose that the zombie is, especially the particular version we have, it has arisen as a mythological way in which the culture is trying to articulate and express the meaning crisis to itself. So horror also has had a significant influence on my thinking about this.
Sure.
And I think, and the thing about, one of the things we might want to explore is, so Chris and I, we've published an article that's come out this year on the Side View. We have what we call a symptomology of the meaning crisis, where we look at various symptomatic expressions of the meaning crisis. And one is a phenomena that other people have been articulating called the virtual exodus. This is the fact that people are now showing a preference for the virtual world, virtual games, for example, like video games. And one of the things about that is to ask yourself, what is it that people are finding in this virtual reality that they find so extremely lacking in reality itself, in actual reality? And then one of the things I'd like to explore, because you said something that sort of piqued my interest, and I think it was somewhat humorous on your part, but you described the science fiction, these literatures, as escapist. But I'm wondering if we could compare science fiction literature to the virtual exodus, because the problem with the virtual exodus is it's largely maladaptive. It seems to be associated with video game addiction, all kinds of other deleterious effects. Extended participation in social media is very bad for mental health, et cetera, et cetera. And whether or not, I don't see science fiction necessarily having these deleterious effects on people. And I'm wondering if by comparison, we might be able to draw out a little bit more about kind of a triangulation approach, compare these different things and see what they might tell us, maybe a bit more about what's going on in the meaning crisis, but also how science fiction may play a role in helping people perhaps adaptively respond to it. So maybe that's something we could explore.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have some kind of questions prepared for you, but I had the feeling that if I ask the questions, that's probably less interesting than just seeing what emerges from us talking together. So that idea of escapism is kind of at the center of all my questions, though, one way or another. Because I see this as very much like a continuum of the overall term that gets given to it is often nerd culture or geek culture. So these are all things that like share this escapist quality. They're usually fantastica in their like the symbols that they're using and giving out to the world. And it's really interesting that people have this sense that they can escape into them and that there's like a world
very much
they can enter into. So that's a huge part of science fiction writing. So the focus of the course is on like creating these stories and how do we do that? And that's usually talked about in terms of world building. So the idea that using this language on the page, we can actually build a world that we can enter into, could be an alien world. And this really got picked up by video games.
Yes, very much, very much.
And all the early games that I think back to, you know, things like The Hobbit, these text adventures, and they were so basic when I think about them, but there was this sense that we were inside them somehow.
And then there's this intermediate genre of role-playing games, which are taking on sort of increasing significance. There's a Scandinavian form that is particularly interesting to me called Jeep form, in which people are doing live role-playing, and the dungeon master is actually a director, and the dungeon master will come and assign like roles to you and say, okay, you're a husband and wife, and you're now you've discovered that your wife has betrayed you, and now act out the scene. And they'll give you things and say, this is a gun, and you have to treat it as props. And they'll suddenly cut and say, okay, now switch roles, and they'll do all this stuff. Because what's really interesting is and notice how this goes the opposite way of escape, which is why I brought it up. They're looking for a phenomena called bleed. What they want is they want the difference between what's happening in the game and their life to bleed, so that the distinction between them breaks down. And the reason is that allows, right, it allows the game to be a place where they can taste, they can try on different identities and ways of looking at the world, and then, right, get them into a form that is transferable back to their everyday life and is in some sense facilitatory for them solving problems that they're finding very difficult to deal with. And what's interesting about that is that also lines up with a lot of literature by my friend and colleague Igor Grossman and other work showing if you ask people about their problems, and they'll tell you their problem, blah, 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 blah. And they almost inevitably tell it from a first person perspective. Then you do this to them. You say, re-describe that same problem from a third person perspective, or how your friend John sees that problem. And then they describe it from that alternative perspective, and then they get insight on how to solve the problem. It's called the Solomon effect. And so this idea of going out and coming back in, which Bleed is really trying to like deliberately create, I find that very intriguing, because that speaks to me, that speaks to me something more like Tolkien's recovery theory of fantasy, rather than a notion of, just escape. And if I'll say one more thing, Damien, and then I'll let you.
You carry on.
Because when you're doing that move, when you're doing this when you're doing this move where you're going out to another perspective in order to come back and correct this perspective you're in, and Tolkien called that the recovery theory, right? And it's a transformation of your seeing and being in this world. That strikes me as very, very similar to a lot of I'm going to put these in quotes because they're contentious terms, a lot of the religious and spiritual practices you see within wisdom traditions, whereby people do some act of self-transcendence through some, other world or deeper dimension of this world, and that is really interesting to me, because that seems to be reliably correlated, I would argue, at least historically, with people being able to cultivate wisdom. And then I would argue, based on the work that I'm doing, that the primary job, wisdom has two jobs, and they're interrelated. They're interdependent jobs. It's to help you comprehensively overcome self-deception and to help increase your sense of meaning in life. And so this sense of, right, these kinds of fantastica, let's call them that. Let's use that as a neutral term, maybe, right? As being, right? I'm proposing that there's the continuum that you see. So yeah, there's a continuum this way with virtual games, but there's a continuum this way, if you'll allow me a spectrum, with very traditional religious and spiritual practices of self-transcendence, whereby people get to a place where they can overcome an egocentric perspective that ameliorates self-deception and enhances the sense of connectedness they have to something larger than themselves, but also more real than themselves. So I said I would stop and give you a chance to.
There's just so much in there. So recovery and the sense of stepping out of ourselves, and the spectrum from like video games to true like spiritual, religious, ecstatic experiences.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Like I'm thinking of it was a documentary about live role playing, and the people who got into live role playing and the different characters involved. And one was like a young man, very, very low self-esteem, and he ended up as the general in the live role playing game. And like 2 years later, he was hugely confident. He had a family, and he was running his own business. And it was like the experiences within the role playing game that had produced this recovery for him. Yeah.
Well, think about these largely, and this is the right word, fictional worlds we take for granted. When you go into therapy, you're stepping into a fictional world in which the therapist is going to take on being your mother or your father, or even some aspect of your own personality, and you're going to interact with them. There's all this enacted symbolism that affords the self-transcendence people are seeking in therapy. Or think about my domain, education. We just forget how weird and fictional education is. You go into this room and you spin, well, not right now, but but you spin all these possible worlds and ideas. And the whole point of that is to get people to educe, to draw from them a new way of seeing the world, a new way of understanding themselves, and a new way of seeing connections between the world and themselves. I mean, that's why they were originally called the liberal arts. They're supposed to liberate us in some important fashion. They're aspirational projects. And so I'm very interested in, and I don't mean anything insulting either way, but like the deep overlap between, religious philosophical literature and, things like science fiction. And the person that really, my favorite author as a kid and growing up was Roger Zelazny, because his work was exactly exploring that connection, right? I think of like, what I consider his masterpiece, Lord of Light. Lord of Light is exactly about what I'm talking about here, right? And the whole point about the book and the way it's structured is, I think, at least this is my interpretation of what Zelazny was trying to do. He was trying to create bleed. He was trying, and it woke me up. I was locked in a fundamentalist Christian worldview. I'd been brought up, and I read that book, and it shattered that for me. And not because not like Sam Harris, some new atheist come in and gave me all these, it was like, boom. I did that thing we're talking about where he took me out of this perspective, opened me to a world, and I recovered this world from it. And I just realized I can be other than I've always been, and I can see other than I've always seen. And I experienced profound recovery. I mean, that's what, and so that book has always just been, I think there are other books you might call, maybe, it won the Hugo Award, was nominated for Nebula. So it's not a
totally
book.
A masterpiece.
Yeah, I think, and so, for me, I'm not claiming all science fiction does this, but what I'm claiming is that there's authors that I'm attracted to that are, I think, explicitly and directly doing exactly what I'm talking about. They're affording this kind of, I don't know what to call it. I don't want to call it pseudo, but it's this para-religious phenomena where people are doing something like what they used to do, with Christianity, had the whole narrative of the passion of the Christ, right? And you identify with Jesus, and that takes you out of yourself. And so what's interesting to me is that profound potential. And I'm wondering if everything on the continuum that we've been talking about satisfies certain hungers for meaning, but some of them do it in a maladaptive sort of junk food version, and then some of them might be moving towards an adaptive version of it.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
This is the thing that that fascinates me and worries me at the same time. So one of the talks in the course is about Star Wars, and being 7 years old, I guess, and seeing Star Wars on a VHS cassette video machine at the time. And I was so fascinated by the movie that we had to borrow the video machine from the family who owned it, so I could watch it 5 times in a row. But the comparison I make is that was probably about the same time as I ate my first cheeseburger as well. And I was really hooked by the cheeseburger in the same way. And so the history of Star Wars, I'm sure you're aware, the hero's journey that's embedded in there, and where that came from. And this is distilled from all of our great religious myths and then placed into Star Wars. So you could make the argument that it's this sacred story and it must have intense meaning. But I also worry that it might just be an addictive substance, that has all the appearance of meaning, but doesn't actually mean anything. And I can't find an answer to that for myself.
Well, let's try it together. Let's try and work on it together right here. I mean, not that I'm proposing that we'll be able to solve it and but dialogos, getting into deep dialogue, is very important to me. So let's let's look at what Chris and I argued about the video games. Like, what is it they're supplying? And you're alluding to Campbell and to Jung in Star Wars, right? But I think there's a broader analysis that we can bring in that incorporates those insights but extends them from cognitive science. So look what's in a video game. So first of all, there's a narrative order. There's a story that you participate in and to which you make a difference, and that story relates your current self to your future self in a clear way. So there's right. So so human beings they need places where they can play with non-logical identity. Persons are weird things. We're not identical the way a coin is identical through time by maintaining all of its properties, or even the way two coins are identical to each other by sharing all their properties. I don't have any of the properties I had when I was 7 years old. I don't even have an atom in my body that I had when I was 7 years old, right? I didn't know anything about cognitive science when I was 7 years old. I was a virgin and I'm not a virgin, like blah, 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 right? So the identity, it's not a logical or a categorical identity. And narrative is a way of practicing non-logical identity so that we can, right, relate to our future self. So narrative is there. What else is there in the video world? Well, there's rules. That world makes sense to me. Like, it makes sense to me. I understand its ordered structure. So I call that a nomological order. That means the principles by which the world is made intelligible to you, and you understand them. And then there's a normative order. And this goes back to what I was saying a few minutes ago. You can self-transcend. You literally level up. Right? You level up, and as you level up, you connect to your better future self, and you connect to more important, deeper versions of the game, bigger scope. You're ultimately going to meet the boss, all that kind of stuff, right? Now, those are the three things that religions traditionally provided for people. Religious worldview, right? They gave you a narrative. Here's the story, and here's how you belong to it. And they gave you a worldview that made sense of things. And then they told you, they gave you practices and communities of practices and institutions whereby you could self-transcend. So the video games, now why is that? Why do we want, well, think about what we really want. What are the things that contribute to meaning in life? Okay, self-transcendence. This is a big thing. People matter. This is called mattering. People need to believe, with good reason, I would argue, that they are connected to something larger to them than themselves, that they matter to something that has a value beyond their egocentric perspective. That's very predictive of having enhanced meaning in life. Right? They need things to make sense. They need a sense of coherence. And then finally, they need a sense of something, it's called purpose or direction. They need that narrative orientation. And so those three orders address three of the most primary, and meaning in life is a real thing. Like, if you don't have meaning in life, that's predictive of suicide, depression, anxiety, social malfunction, like the opposite is the case. And by the way, this is so coincidental for video games, because video games have a fourth feature. Video games are flow induction machines. Right? They put you into the flow state, right? Really, really reliably. And the thing about the flow state, it's really predictive also of enhanced meaning in life. If you were to ask me, you get to ask Damien one question, and from that determine how much meaning in life he has. This is the question I would ask Damien. How often do you enter the flow state?
Not as often as I want to.
Yeah. And that's exactly the right answer. That's a good answer. That's a really good answer. So think about this. Why? What's flow all about? Well, flow's all about that terrific sense of being deeply connected to the world, of having ongoing insight, of getting a good, not just theoretical, but an enacted sense of being coupled to the deeper patterns of the world. Really great, what's called implicit learning. So it's this connectedness and sense making and insight that give people a tremendous sense, right? Now, all of those are going on in the video game, and they're all maladaptive because they're not set up to transfer back to the real world. So within, it's this weird, almost ironic paradox. Within the video game, you're getting everything that you want for meaning, but you're getting it in a situation that is not designed to transfer. So it's not like the situation of bleed. It's not like when people go to church. People go to church and they go into a huge simulation, a huge, this is not meant to be insulting, a huge video game in which they're doing all of this stuff. But the idea is that's supposed to bleed. It's set up, it's designed, it's cultivated to transfer out. And so the thing that, and sorry, this is a long preamble, but I think this has allowed me to formulate a question, is because I've seen work on this. Is the Jedi religion that came out of Star Wars a real religion, right? And Chris and I took this up in some of the work we've been doing. It's really odd about this because you'll meet a lot of these people and they're from that demographic category, the nuns, NONES. They have no. Are you religious? No. And then they'll go to these conventions and they're dressed up as people and they enact things and like, oh wow, right? You're very religious. You just don't recognize it. So the question I want to ask, and I hope this doesn't sound too simplistic, is how much bleed is there? How much transfer? How much does this participation in the Star Wars world genuinely enhance their capacity for wisdom in their lives? Is it transformative of their sense of self, their sense of world, and does it afford measurable increase? So for example, if somebody is doing a lot of Star Wars stuff and that transferred such that they were getting into the flow state more often in their lives, or they were more capable of stepping back and looking at their own perspective and transforming it, then I wouldn't say it's an addiction. I would say it's actually providing something like recovery. Sorry, that was a long argument, but I wanted to answer your question well.
No, that's fantastic. So what leaps out of it for me is that, well, there's kind of like an Alan Watts idea about Catholicism, that Catholicism started failing people when it was translated into English, because at the point that you couldn't understand it, you could essentially make of it what you wanted to, and you could find things in there. So I have an idea maybe that if the audience could work with almost anything, if they were wired up to take bleed from it.
They could. I mean, I think there are. I think there are like essential features that have to be in existence in an environment in order for it to be one in which people can exercise cognitive agency, experience insight, solve their problems. And because you can see this by the kinds of ways in which you can modify environments and people will have very aversive reactions to it. So like I wonder about that. Let me be clear. I'm a pluralist in this, in that I think there are multiple ways of setting these up so it will work. And I think, in fact, I would argue stronger. I think it has to be that way because people are in different historical, cultural, and environmental contexts. And so making sense of that is going to have variation. But let me give you an analogy of how I'm thinking about this. And maybe it'll be helpful. Because this is a question that really concerns me as a scientist. Because if there aren't universals, I can't study it as a scientist, right? Because that's what you have to have, right? And there are universals about flow. So flow is a good example of a universal. Across all of those differences I've mentioned, cultural, linguistic, socioeconomic, gender, right? Historical background, occupation, personality, right? People, when they get into the flow state, people in all of those situations can get into the flow state and they describe it in detail with using almost the exact same words. So there's something universal, which means there's something functional. Okay, so let me try and use an analogy. So the thing I study as a scientist, and because it really links personality, intelligence, and consciousness together, is a process I call relevance realization. It's this amazing ability you have. There's an overwhelming, like people don't realize, it's an astronomical number. There's an overwhelming amount of information available to you at any moment, an overwhelming amount of information in your long-term memory, and there's an overwhelming number of ways you can put sequences of behaviors together and generate patterns of action. And so you can't search all of those. You can't even search most of them. You do this really weird thing, and it sounds like a Zen koan. Somehow you intelligently ignore most of that information and zero in on the relevant information. Not perfectly, but really, really well, so that you often do the appropriate thing in a situation, and you remember the appropriate information from your long-term memory, and you, right? And by the way, this has a lot to do with that sense of connectedness, because here's the analogy I want to make. Think about the way in which evolution is a universal process in which you have two things at work. You have something that's generating variation, like the variation within a population. And then you have a selective process that's cutting it down, limiting it, natural selection, right? Competition for scarce resources. And so what you have is there's a feedback loop, reproduction. Within it, there's variation, and then there's selection, and there's variation and selection. And the feedback loop is constantly revolving with change. That's what evolution is. Well, your brain is doing something analogous to that all the time. You have a sensory motor loop. You're taking in information, and then you're generating behavior, even moving your eyes around, right? And so there's this constant sensory motor loop. And notice how your brain, like, there's pressure on you right now to vary. There's a pressure to be distracted and think about other things. And, but there's also a countervailing one. No, focus, stay connected. And you're doing this all the time, and you're constantly evolving. What's the relative information that's happening right here, right now? And so you're constantly doing that. Now, if that analogy holds, then I can go up to the point I want to make. Evolution is a universal process, but it doesn't produce the same products. Everything is evolving, but that doesn't mean a shark and a baboon are the same animal. They're very, very different creatures. And so I think the stories we generate can have terrific variety to them, but that doesn't mean that they're just arbitrarily created. In the same way, right? That's what I'm trying to get at. Because we're always engaged in relevance realization, right? We're always having to fit to the environment. It can't be arbitrary, but it can be vast, right? That's what I'm trying to get at with a real pluralism in this kind of things.
Yeah. So, all of the really popular science fiction stories, they all have, all the Fantastica, these archetypal characters. Within them, and they just repeat again and again and again across the stories. And one way that you could interpret that, perhaps slightly cynically, is maybe it's just like some copying. Maybe people aren't seeking originality in the stories, or maybe there's something else here, which is like this evolutionary process of storytelling, which is going to throw up these archetypes again and again and again for people.
Exactly. I'm not saying that Jung is necessarily wrong, and there might be some predispositions biologically, but it also might be something very analogous to convergent evolution. Like you look at the ichthyosaur, which is a reptile, and you look at the dolphin, which is a mammal, and they look the same because they're in the same environment and they're in the same ecological niche, and you get convergent evolution, or you get different species, right, radically different, converging on the evolution of different kinds of eyes, but eyes keep showing up, right, across many different species, right? So I think it's very plausible that there will be these archetypal patterns. And what's interesting about them then is we should pay very careful attention to them. I'm not dismissing the possibility that there might be laziness and formulaic thinking involved, but let's say that when that's not the case, there's the real possibility here that these archetypal patterns in story making are not escapist because they're actually pointing to universal affordances of how we can recover the world by being more deeply connected to it, by seeing real possibilities in who we can be and what we can see.
Hmm. And that's like the fundamental story of fantasy or science fiction, is becoming somebody that we could become.
Exactly.
Some potential we could draw out of ourselves.
Yes. But isn't that, I mean, that to me strikes again that it's on an adaptive continuum with what would it be like, we sing a revival of Stoicism. I'm involved in that. Well, Stoicism is, sorry, this sounds overly simplistic, and it is. It's a very complex phenomenon. There's lots going on. But if you'll allow me a bit of a slogan, just for the purposes of conversation here, Stoicism is basically the religion of internalizing Socrates, right? Learning to see and be the way Socrates would be in situations. And that's a long practice. And it takes a lot of imaginative exercises. You have to do things like the view from above, where you practice imaginatively rising above the world. So alter your sense of what's relevant and important. You have to, practice redescribing things. There's all these fictional, imaginal practices you engage in order to internalize Socrates. And that's, or, the Christians who are internalizing Christ. St. Paul, it's not I who live, but Christ who lives within me. Or the Buddhist seeking to, realize the Buddha nature within the, it's the same. I'm sorry, but I see it as, like I say, I see this on a continuum. When I encounter certain figures in what would be the deep difference? Because many people admit that the picture we have of Socrates from Plato and Xenophon is probably a mixture of fiction and historical accuracy, right? So is there that much of a difference between internalizing Socrates and internalizing Gandalf in order to become wiser, right? There's a lot more philosophy developed around Socrates. There's a lot more traditions. There's Stoicism. And of course, Christianity has built up around, and there isn't something analogous to Gandalf. But I don't see why there couldn't be, right? I don't see why there couldn't be. So, I mean, it keeps coming back again and again and again. Yes, these stories don't give us knowledge the way science and history give us knowledge, because they're not trying to give us knowledge. They're not trying to give us information. They're trying to afford transformation. They're giving us wisdom. And if they are really giving us wisdom, then I don't think it's right to think of them as addictive or escapist at all.
So that raises the question for a fan, for someone who's like living a lot of their life, to assess like the value of what they're engaging with. And maybe what I'm more interested in is like the responsibility of a creator. Sitting down to tell these stories. Maybe you're like a storyteller in the video games industry, and you have like some kind of intuition that these things are important but maladaptive. Like, how would we start to think about making them adaptive, making them bleed for people?
Well, I'm actually involved in a project with a former student and colleague of mine, Daniel Gregg. He's actually trying to design an online live action role playing game with some video elements in it. That's designed to get people it is specifically designed to create bleed, but not bleed at the level of your own psychodynamic problems like in Jeep form, but bleed at the level of the cultural problems that people are trying to wrestle with as they wrestle with the meaning crisis. And so, actuality is excellent proof of possibility, right? The fact that, people are, I know somebody who's specifically trying to do this, and I know people on the other end where, they're trying to create practices that involve this kind of serious play. I don't know why. Well, I do know. Sorry, that I got to retract that because I realized what I was about to say was just false. Um, if we could make a priority to create, because there's no technical psychological reason why we couldn't make these things be bleed worthy and be set up explicitly as partake in this, and then here's also bridging practices. Here's how you play the game, and then here's the practices that help bridge you between the game and the real world. Here's an analogy. I'm a martial artist. You do the form, but you also, you do things like sparring and other things. How do you transfer it maybe to a self-defense situation? Or more importantly, like when you're doing something like Tai Chi Chuan, you really read deeply the Tao Te Ching, because that's the bridging manual. That's how do I take what I'm training in this very weird ritual thing I'm doing and make it bleed into my life. In fact, Damien, when that happened to me, one of the most profound experiences I had, I was doing a combination of Tai Chi Chuan, Vipassana, and Metta. And I was doing it in graduate school, and I'm just trundling along because I was really interested in cultivating wisdom way back when. And I was pursuing it very deeply. And I wasn't really, from first person perspective, noticing that much, but I was trying to do exactly this. I was trying to get it to become, I was reading the literature, I was at least setting up the context of making it transferable. And people started coming to me and saying, what's going on with you? And at first I thought, oh no, because in graduate school, you're afraid you're offending other people all the time, right? And I said, what is it? What is it? And they said, you're different. You write differently. You talk differently. You argue differently. You're more balanced. You're more flexible. You're more responsive. So what had happened is this very weird thing I was doing in Tai Chi Chuan was bleeding out into my life. There's no reason why we can't set these things up. Right. What if we read a great science fiction story and then put around it, like, how does this transfer? How does this transfer to your life? Not just idea transfer. Like, is there analogous things you can do in order to try and transfer it into your life? I'm talking with somebody right now who's becoming, a friend of mine, Nick Winkleman. He wrote a book called The Language of Coaching, and and it's really, really good. He talks about when he's trying to coach somebody, finding the analogy for them that helps them, right, transform into, it's like, okay, so the problem is you need to run and you're sprinting, but you're not doing it right. I need you to sprint as if you were an airplane taking off. He'll say that. And then at some point, you're now running up a hill. How would you move your leg? And imagine yourself in that. And then people imagine that, and then they recover, or at least draw out the way they're supposed to move and see, and they could do that. We have already domains in which we're practicing how to bridge, how to transfer. And we have histories of doing this. This is what the religious histories and the religious philosophies were all about. We have the resources, we could bring them to bear. There's no reason why we couldn't build this around like these stories right now.
This makes me think of two things. One is like because I find that in the science fiction world, there's like a conflicted attitude to criticism of stories, because they're things that we love. So like a critical attitude to them seems offensive to some people. Right. But there's also a love of doing this, of talking about the stories and drawing meaning out of them. And this seems like the basis of a bridging activity, the critical. I think so. Yeah.
I think that for me, the questions, so this is something I do work on, about what kind of things actually affords the bridging. So sorry, give me 5 minutes, and this will sound like a digression, but it involves stories, and allow me to make a point.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's a problem called the Dunker radiation problem. It's a classic insight problem. The person has, a tumor at the center of their skull. If you try and open the skull, you'll expose them to too much infection, they'll die, right? But you can beam an X-ray beam and it won't kill them, but it will kill all the intervening tissue when it kills the tumor. So what do you do? By the way, this is no longer fiction. We now do this with a thing called the gamma knife. We beam in right? Okay. So it's a real thing. And so many people like, well, how do I solve this? And the solution is, what you do is you break it up into a lot of low intensity beams that only intersect at a lethal level of intensity where the tumor is, right? So instead of one beam of lethal intensity, you have multiple beams of sub-lethal intensity that intersect just at the point. And like I said, they now literally do this with a thing called the gamma knife. When they need to take out a small, I've seen somebody cured of lifetime tremors where they found a little patch of the neurons that they needed to get rid of, and they did the gamma knife on them to kill them. So this is okay. So you get the problem. That's the Dunker radiation problem.
Yeah.
Okay. So now let's say I'm gonna put people in a situation, and what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna give them a story to read. And the story goes like this: there's a general who wants to attack a fortress, and the fortress is like at the center, like 4 causeways, right, that lead to the fortress. And if the general marches his army down any one of these pathways, there's the garrison in the fortress, and they're like the 300. They will come out and like fight to the death, and right, and the general will be too long fighting the battle. He'll go out of supply. So what does he do? Well, he breaks his army up into 4 equal components and has them converge simultaneously on the fortress. Because as the garrison comes out to meet any one of the 4, the other 3 can attack the undefended fortress and take it. Okay, so you give people this story about attacking the fortress, then you give them some intervening task, blah, 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 they're doing something. And then you unexpectedly give them the Dunker radiation problem, right? Then they read this story and they get no facilitation. They're no better than people who did not read the story at solving the Dunker radiation problem. And you say, what's going on? Why not? Well, here's the problem. The problem is, at the level of the ideas and the propositions, the 2 stories are the same, but that's not the kind of transfer your brain is looking for. Because think about the task. The tasks are very different. When I'm doing the generals, my task is to comprehend an existing solution and story. But when I face the Dunker radiation problem, I'm trying to solve an unsolved problem, which is a very different task. So although propositionally the stories are very similar, procedurally they're very, very different. Now there's a bunch of research showing the opposite. If I make 2 things procedurally similar, I'll get transfer. I'll get powerful transfer. And so these bridging practices, they can't be practices about just like taking ideas from that world and transferring them. They have to be deeper. They have to be about, like, that's why I keep saying ways of seeing and ways of being. That's what's right. And that's what will transfer. Like it's really astonishing how powerful that level is in how much it affects transfer.
The other thing that came out was so many of these stories are now like these huge corporate projects, you know. They cost like hundreds of millions of dollars, and like I went to see the Avengers movie in Bali when it came out, and the whole island came to a halt for it. So everyone in the world is now like watching the same stories. But then we also I think everyone sees the value in like independent creators, small creators. There's some level that we need to actually engage with like people who are making the stories for us.
That goes exactly to the point I was making. Right? If all people are doing is consuming, that's at the propositional level. But if they don't practice the creating and the living within it and creating it so other people could come to live within it, right? Then they're not going to get that kind of transfer and bleed. That's why live action role playing is so important. You're not just consuming, you're also producing, and especially in situations where there's a high degree of improvisation required. Like, so people have to, I mean, I think what you said is very astute. People have to get into a sense of like, sorry, it sounds hubristic, but what it's like to create these worlds. What's it like to move in them? What's it like to critically assess them, because when you're writing and creating, you have to engage in self-correction. If all they're ever doing is consuming the finished product and the idea, they're like the people who are just reading the story of the fortress, and they won't be able to solve the Dunker radiation problem when they come across it. But if you get them to generate a solution that's analogous, then when they come to then they solve it. Then they solve it. That's what I was trying to point to, but you put it better than I did, right? The idea is people have to have this participatory relationship. They have to be involved in the process of making it and appreciating it and correcting it and refining it, if they're going to be afforded the ability to transfer from the world of science fiction to their everyday life. Well, at least that's what I would argue. That's what I would argue.
I absolutely see it happening. So there's the science fiction fan community, and it calls itself fandom, and that kind of puts everyone in the community in a position of being a fan, I guess. But when I look at that community, especially as it's formed around the internet, it's become tremendously creative. It's like a vast creative community with all different kind of levels of engagement of how people are making. You know, it might be participating in role-playing games and then trying to write your own novel. And this is all a process. It's not just some creators and consumers. There's a whole process of bridging from the stories. And
that's fantastic. Yeah. So it wouldn't take that much of tweaking, because that's what I see. I mean, I don't write fiction, but I write. And of course, I appreciate this in people who are fiction writers. I mean, let's go back to Lord of Light. So, I mean, you could read that book as, oh, wow, this is just what's it like to be a god? And, you know, the blurring between science fiction and fantasy and blah, blah, blah. Or you can think, and you know, in the ways Zelazny ends the book is he almost hits the reader over the head with a hammer and saying, look, the point of this is to transfer it to your life, right? He at the end of the book. So writers, when they're creating the world, they're not, at least I would say good writers aren't creating it to be this self-enclosed escape. They're creating it to educate, and I mean that in a deep sense, people for their lives. Right? And so if the fans aren't just, I want to just make this cool story, but if they try to emulate, you know, the procedures of the really good writers, I want to make a story that's right. It'll be like a great symbolic act. It'll be really attractive and draw people in, but it won't be an escape, because once they're in there, they'll be changed and transformed. And it'll make them think about their lives. I mean, it wouldn't take that much to bring that into the fandom. Like in creating these things, create them so that they afford recovery, they afford self-transcendence, they afford transformation. I think that strikes me as like a really adjacent possible thing people could be doing right now.
Sure. Would that become, like in your discussions with Jordan Hall, about the religion that is not a religion?
Yeah. Why not? Exactly. Yeah, it could be. I mean, and that's what Daniel's trying to do with that live action role playing game. He's trying to create a structure whereby people can engage in the religion that's not a religion. Because like I've argued earlier, and I'm not proselytizing for any religion, but these religions are storehouses, and we should treat them with reverence, because they have been preserved. And not as dead museums, but as living things, right? They are storehouses for, you know, how to overcome self-deception and how to afford enhanced meaning in life. Those connections and those, right, that deeper connectedness that we've been talking about throughout. And so why not learn as much as we can? But the interesting thing about it is we can play in a world where we're not committing to any crazy, wacky metaphysics in order to cultivate the wisdom.
In fact, I was just thinking about that we have. So if there's a similar process to like the formation of like Christianity or something, you know, the people that had so much less access to information. This kind of one story emerges, and everyone has to hop on board with this story. And now we're in like this information overload society.
Yep. Right. Yep.
So as a group of people doing something similar, like all creating their own story, and everyone has like a meta awareness that these are just stories, but we can exchange them with each other, and they achieve some kind of growth, you know.
That's exactly it. And if the evolutionary analogy I gave you earlier works, if it's in some sense correct, these stories, while being, particular to that group, are not, again, they're not arbitrarily disconnected from other stories, because there are shared processes across the stories. So you could have something much more, like a co-op, where there are different groups doing different things, but they can talk to each other, they can facilitate each other, and this is already happening. At least it's happening in relevantly similar domains in which people are like, I get involved with all these communities. There's these emerging communities around movement and mindfulness and self-transformation, and they're all they're all emerging, and I would argue, and many of them agree with me, in response to the meaning crisis. And you have the same kind of pluralism. There's real universals between them, so they can deeply talk to each other. But there's no wow, but this is the right set of practices. There's there's what I call an ecology of practices. But just like there could be an ecology of practices, there can be an ecology of stories. In fact, there should be an ecology of stories enmeshed within an ecology of practices that affords the bridging of any particular story to a person's life and context.
This seems to give like a whole new value to things that sometimes get dismissed. And I've been guilty of like being dismissive about them as well at times, like fan fiction, like the whole process of creating new versions of Harry Potter. And some of them become really ironic and rich and deep, and some of them are much shallower than that. But, there's something there.
Well, I mean, there's the project of internalizing Harry Potter, the way people internalize Socrates. It's interesting because this was part of the Gnostic tradition. Gnosticism wasn't a religion. It's more like fundamentalism. It's a style of a way in which you do various kinds of religion. But the thing about Gnosticism, and April DeConnick made that really clear in the Gnostic New Age, and this is one of the things that really pissed off the emerging Orthodox Church, is this kind of fan fiction was part of the practice.
Oh,
you were expected to generate your own stories, your own gospels, the proliferation, and I like that because it has the word life in the center of it. The proliferation, and this is one of the criticisms that what became the Orthodox Church constantly made of the Gnostics. Everybody, there's this constant proliferation of gospels and stories and myths and practices, and and they saw it as just crazy chaos. But again, you see that, and so I think I can understand why the church wanted to clamp it down, because it was trying to provide, a glue for the empire and blah, blah, blah. There's all these historical reasons. But that was an enormously powerful time. And it shows that it's possible to have a vibrant spirituality in which you have an ecology of stories, an ecology of practices, and you have something deeply analogous to fan fiction constantly going on.
I'm feeling a bit mind blown. I really love the idea of this, that something like this could be drawn out of sci-fi fandom, or that it's all going on there, like implicitly, and there might,
of course,
be a tremendous healing involved with it as well.
Well, it's the same thing that's going on very analogously to all these communities I'm talking about. I'm not trying to be the founder of a religion. That's ridiculous.
Sure.
It's really deeply ridiculous. What I would like to do, and I'm trying to exemplify it with you, is I'd like to provide people with, the conceptual vocabulary, the theoretical grammar, ecologies of practices that are really well vetted in terms of our cutting edge cognitive science, to help people, explicate what's already implicit and emerging, and communicate and coordinate and, and even curate. That's what I think is a real possibility. That's what excites me, because we need, now I'll be a little bit more, I don't know what to say. I've been serious throughout, but maybe a little bit more dour. We need to address the meaning crisis. We really do. First of all, the amount of suffering it's causing is tremendous. And it's been exacerbated very significantly, I would argue, by COVID. And the meaning crisis is really weakening us, almost like an illness, at a profound level of our cognition and our agency, so that we can't deal with the other pressing issues that are really threatening us with, serious loss of life, potential extinction. I don't mean to sound alarmist or anything, but there's a lot of stuff that's happening right now. And and the interesting thing is, as you know, science fiction often addresses these concerns very, very deeply, very profoundly. And so I think if we have to, and this is why, and this is part of the discussions I have with Jordan Hall, because his main argument is this meta crisis is not only accelerating, the rate of its acceleration is increasing, right? It's right. We have to coordinate and actualize and invent everything we can as massively and as parallel and as dynamically as we can right now, I would argue. And, I do think there's a potential in what we've been talking about. And if we could actualize that and direct it towards stealing the culture, I think that would be fantastic. I would do everything I could in my power to try and help bring that about.
There's something in Jordan Hall's acceleration upon acceleration that is quite science fictional in itself.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, very much.
Something
very much.
Yeah. And we had to be able to understand that with stories. Like a singularity kind of demands constantly remaking the story that is making sense.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And that's exactly that. And so Jordan and I have talked about how that brings with it, like there's a faith in these stories that's a different kind. I would say it's one of the older meanings of faith. Faith has become this assertion of things you shouldn't believe, sort of like asserting things that don't have good evidence or reason behind them. But there's an older meaning, and it's still present in our word faithfulness. Like, me being faithful to my partner doesn't mean that I believe crazy things about her. It means that I couple myself so that I'm constantly renewing what I can be and how I can see her, so she can constantly grow in how she can be. And we are committed to that. We are faithful to each other. We're trying to maintain a continuity of contact, not give some final version of anything. We're not trying to give a final solution, ominous words there, or a final story about anything. That's not what being faithful means at all. And so Jordan and I talk about the way, right, this ongoing, again, similar to the Gnostics, right, this process of ongoing reinventio. The Latin word inventio doesn't mean, it means simultaneously to create and to discover. So I like to use that term, the constant inventio of new stories that keep us faithful to a reality that is itself undergoing significant change. The way I am faithful to this very complex being called my lover, right? She's incredibly complex, as any person is. And Alicia Uraro talks about this. You know what stories are really good for? She's one of the people that did a lot of important work on the nature of dynamical systems. Stories get you formatting your cognition so that you are in the right form of information processing for tracking dynamical systems. And so if the world is, right, this massively complex, self-organizing, dynamical mess, which it is, we need stories that are themselves recursively changing so that we can track that we can maintain a continuity of contact. We can be faithful to that ever-changing reality. And so again, I think science fiction and fantasy point the way. for doing that sort of thing.
We've been talking for a little bit over an hour. I don't want to take up too much of your time.
Well, I mean, I can talk for another 10, 15 minutes or so,
Okay.
but I also don't want to be imposing. So
no, that's fine. Because I there's another question I'd like to ask, and I think we're also like just on the edge of something really interesting, which kind of this recursive nature of stories. So that seems to be in science fiction. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Science fiction writers are looking really closely at the point of the world where it's changing.
Yeah.
To, like stitch new metaphors around it. And then those stories are like being brought back into a community who are either accepting them or rejecting them, and then putting them into the world. And I think that relates to the question that I wanted to ask, because, you know, I've like spoken to like quite well-known physicists, you know, and they secretly tell me about their interest in science fiction.
Yes.
And you know, you yourself, you said you're a big science fiction fan, and I assume like you would be. So it's kind of there in our intellectual life, but we also feel like we can't like talk about it or put it at the center of things that we're doing quite often. I'm interested in why that is. Sometimes maybe you have some experience of why.
I do, and I want to explore that with you, because I think that's a wonderful question. Because I want to do what I've done before. I want to set it into a bigger family of where people do that. Because there's other things that people won't talk about, but have a profound impact even on how they do their science. You know, there's like 40% of the population have mystical experiences.
Yeah.
Right. Right. Or these profound experiences of awe and transformative experiences. And if you take somebody out and have a dinner with a scientist and, you know, give them perhaps a little bit of wine and get them why did you get into this? First, they'll give you the career answer, the one that they have to put on their CV, right? Blah, blah, blah. But wait and go. And then you'll get, no, they're actually wrestling with problems of meaning, right? And making sense. And they're also, right, there's been often something that they had a moment where they had a realization, and you know, both in the sense of they're aware and also the sense of being connected to what's more real, and that really drives them. And yet we don't talk about these experiences because they're not part of the sort of, I don't know what to call it, the Enlightenment model of how the mind works, which is right. This model that the mind is this monolithic, monological thing that works best on its own and it's self-sufficient. And this is all bullshit, by the way. I mean, it's really not true about how we work. So that doesn't have to be the case. If you go back far enough, like even just before, in the Renaissance, you can see it, but farther back, you can also see it. When you had like a Neoplatonic worldview, people thought it was very vitally important that their spirituality and their scientific practice were deeply interwoven, mutually explicated, and mutually affording. But for various historical reasons that I go over in the series, right, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, we've now got a place where those are oppositional to each other. And the thing about it, I'm going to propose to you, Damien, is science fiction has enough, and we've been talking about it all throughout today. It's close enough, maybe not at the ideal level, but really at the procedural and existential level. It's close enough to a mythology and self-transcendence and all of the stuff. Even trying to induce awe. Right. And godlike beings can show up in it, and people can undergo radical transformation, like all of that. That's just too close to spirituality and religion and mystical experiences and all that kind of stuff. And you don't take that seriously, right? You don't take that seriously, because even though it's not true, we think that, scientists are these like, I want to make another point, because it has to do with current work I'm doing about scientists and exactly this kind of thing. And this is work I'm doing with Dan Chiappi. So you've got the NASA scientists, literal rocket scientists in some sense, who are moving around the rovers on Mars, like Spirit and opportunity, right? They're moving the rovers around. Now, because of the delay, there's no joystick control. There's no joystick control. So it's not like a video game at all. What they do is they get batches of black and white pictures, right, that they pour over, and then they send back batches of command, and there's all this delay. So that sounds all very abstract and cold. What do they look for? What are they looking for when they try to hire somebody into the group? This goes to some of the ethnography done by Vervaeke and others. They look for people who can generate this experience. They feel like they're on Mars. It's a sense of being on Mars. They can somehow, right, which is exactly what people want in the video game, right? That sense of presence, the sense it's real because I'm in it. I'm there. I'm in the video world. It doesn't have to do with how real the video world is, because people can get the that sense of presence in things like Tetris. So how are these scientists getting this sense of being on Mars, and why is that so important? Well, they do this really weird stuff. They do this stuff like this. First of all, they identify with the rover. They'll say, I need to go here, or we need to go there, or I can't move my wheel right now. And so they don't say the rover, they first of all, they anthropomorphize the rover, but they also technomorphize themselves. So they do stuff like this. They'll say, okay, they'll put the phone in front of them, and they'll say, oh, wait, there's a rock. And they'll put their hands up like this, and they're on a swivel chair. And I need to, like, what they do is they enact, remember symbolic enactment? They enact being the rover. They enact it, right? They enact it, right? They technomorphize themselves. And this gets so weird, right? They'll say, and I wish I had it up, but this is like, I've got talks online if people want to see it, where I actually read the literal quotes. So I'm not exaggerating here. They'll say stuff like this. I was working in the garden, and my right wrist kept hurting me. And then I got to the lab, and Rover's right wheel wasn't working properly. And I'm not saying it's magic, but there's some kind of they do this weird stuff. Now, they don't put any of that in the articles they publish. Yeah, of course not. But all of that enacted symbolism, all of that bleed is what they're looking for, because that actually gives people knowing what it's like to be on Mars. And that enables them to do the field work, do the science. But we don't report any of that, because no. But that's what they're actually doing in order to do the science. So the line there between them doing the science and something, Paul Anderson, right, wrote a really classic science fiction story called Call Me Joe, right, where he's sort of connecting to some biological avatar on a planet to do exploration, and eventually the identity between him and that biological avatar breaks down, and he right. It's the same thing with the scientists. It's the same thing with the scientists and the rover.
Yeah. Well, there's something like really interesting in science fiction, just in like the two words, science and fiction. It is this meeting point of these things that shouldn't be mixed.
Yeah,
in life,
exactly.
You know, and there's a whole spectrum of people who are into science fiction, and there's a solid group of people who are like the hard science fiction fans, and they they just want the book to just expand on ideas from science, and there's like an annoyance or an anger if it does something fantastical around that. And I can see a really good reason for that, because you want to look just at this point of what's changing in the world, so that's a valid reason. And I can also see that there's like something within yourself that you're trying not to acknowledge in that.
Exactly.
As well.
But I love what you just said. I hadn't thought about it that way, but that's brilliant. Symbolon means to join together. The Greek word symbolon, and the word like science fiction is you said we're joining together the things that shouldn't be joined together. But of course, that's what all symbolic behavior does. I hadn't thought about that. That's really good. That's really good. So I guess maybe one way of encapsulating what I've been saying to you is we should be joining them together. We should. And I understand why people like hard science fiction. I get that.
Mm.
But the problem with hard science fiction, well, not problem, because there's nothing problematic about it. One thing that I would find problematic is people being imperial about it, saying only this counts or something like that. It is, when I look at the hard science fiction from the 1950s, it seems so stupid now, because the science, right? The science that they thought was going to be the unchallenged science has been massively challenged and overturned. And the fact that there's also now like some of our sciences, like biology and cognitive science, are going through almost revolutionary changes in the understanding. And so people should perhaps be a little bit looser about the commitment to the metaphysics within a scientific worldview. Now, I'm not espousing irrationalism or anything ridiculous like this, but what's the worry with science fiction that's a little bit more speculative? Is it that and you alluded to this, what's wrong with it? Like, because it's not real? That can't be the answer, because it's all of it's science fiction. Like, what's the concern? Maybe I should ask you, instead of making it a rhetorical question, what do you think? Like, you have more familiarity with this group than I do. Like I said, I cut my teeth on New Wave, and New Wave was the critical response to hard sci-fi, right? Yeah. Right. So I've always been, maybe I should be, I mean, I've read some of the hard sci-fi, like Heinlein and other people, earlier people like that. But
actually, when you go looking for it, it's very difficult to really find hard science fiction, because science fiction will just insist on becoming fantasy in some way. It just kind of split, like however much you try to limit yourself to just like a purely materialist idea of the world, your imagination is going to like escape around it. And I think what's happening is that there's lots of personal fantasies that really appeal to people who are just to that hard science fiction mindset. So actually what's going on inside the story is like the fulfillment of lots of personal fantasies.
Right.
Not actually being a robot, that isn't somebody's fantasy, but there's something in that expresses that. So it's a way of saying that, like, my fantasy is very real and important, and other people's fantasies aren't.
Oh, so it's just narcissism.
Well, I think there's a little bit of that in there. A little bit, but it's probably very difficult to escape, because you know you're having reinforced that well, you've been told by the culture that your worldview is completely correct, right already, and it's very difficult to get out of that, I think, unless something breaks you out of it.
But I mean, for me, again, and maybe people don't agree with this, for me, it's the philosophical, and I mean that in both senses. I mean philosophical in the way we currently use it, meaning this, reflection on, people's epistemological and metaphysical frameworks, but I also mean it in the ancient sense of the Philia Sophia, the collective love, the shared love for wisdom. I mean, in both senses of it. That, to me, the philosophical potential of science fiction is the real potential we've been talking about here together. And right, if you aren't willing to step back and, at least in a symbolic world, question your metaphysics and your epistemology and how you are aspiring to being a better, more virtuous self, I mean, how else are you going to do it? I mean, I mean, it's like, I mean, I'm sorry, I'm getting really presumptuous, maybe even pretentious, and I don't mean to be, but I'm trying to ask a genuinely sympathetic question. Is it, aren't you condemning yourself to kind of a philosophically impoverished way of being? And that seems to me to be a very dangerous thing. I'm a scientist. So theories are going to come and go. What ultimately matters I mean, what matters existentially for me is not the knowledge I have, but the understanding I can cultivate, and ultimately the wisdom that I might, to some degree, realize. That's what matters to me.
And I think that's the fight that science fiction has been having with itself from the new wave onwards. Really, the new wave were the people who were starting to say that we had this meeting of science and fiction, and we think there's something really important here, but you're only using it for this one framework, this one way of seeing the world, and we can open it to many, many more ways of seeing the world. Like, I don't know if you have any awareness of like the Hugo Awards, or what happened with them politically over like the last.
No, I don't know about that. No, what happened?
Well, they've always been like statistically very dominated by men and like white American culture.
Right.
And there's been like a huge culture war over them. Significantly before, it manifested like more broadly across the culture.
Oh, that's
like
very interesting.
Onwards, and it was really, about diversity. That's the word that you'd give it in the awards. Yeah. But it really was about intellectual diversity. What are we actually talking about in science fiction? And that was like a huge fight online. I was writing about it for The Guardian at the time. So it was very interesting to live through, and I could see it kind of mirroring out into the broader culture.
Right. Wow. That's really prescient. That's really interesting. That's really cool. I remember I don't read as much as I used to because I'm so busy. But I remember, I guess I see it retrospectively now. Like, I was bumping up against something when I read Ancillary Justice, and I was getting that from that book. Even the way she's using pronouns in that book.
Yeah. Oh, that was like the book that defined that latest kind of shift in science fiction.
Right.
Done a lot. Cyberpunk had done a lot, but it was still kind of very monocultural at the time. And Ancillary Justice was like the breakthrough of a lot of women writers and writers of color. All happened around that time.
Right.
And science fiction is much more interesting for it. Like, it's truly fascinating at the moment what's being made in the science fiction field.
That's
impossible to keep track of as well, because there's just far too much happening.
Well, yeah, we have the proliferation of pluralism. But again, that doesn't mean that that doesn't connote or have to connote or even denote chaos. There's a possibility, like we've talked about earlier, about there being cooperative coordination between all of these different aspects.
Have you ever been to a Worldcon science fiction convention?
I've been to. I haven't been to a science fiction one. I've been to a Comic-Con and a couple of things like that. Very similar in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And I was just, and I remember that went into the book chapter that Chris and Philip and I wrote, because I'd come away from one of those, and I went and I said, I've just been in this, I was just overwhelmed by how religious, and I think that's the right word, this event was. And it was like, wow. I mean, if Christianity could tap into this, the churches would be packed, right? And it was like, so yeah, I have been, and it had this just huge impression on me.
I guess Christianity's problem is that it's really not into fan fiction. Doesn't.
Well, because it suppressed the Gnostics. Yeah, it shouldn't have. That was maybe that's its big long-term mistake. Maybe at the time that was the right thing to do, but long-term it really pays. I mean, and you see this coming out, right, in kind of a shadow side. You see Protestantism and then the endless proliferation, ongoing, accelerating proliferation of Protestant denominations.
Yeah,
it's like this Gnostic underbelly came back and resurfaced in this profound way.
Wow. So like the internecine warfare between religious denominations, it's very similar. You have like subgenres of science fiction that all have their own idea of what science fiction is doing and what it should.
There you go. There you go.
Thank you for wow, really, thank you for this discussion, John. I'm really blown away.
Well, thank you very much. I want you to have, of course, complete priority for this for your course and your podcast. But if at some point you could share the recording with me, I'd love to upload this on my channel too.
Sure, I'll just give it to you, John. We go ahead and do that. Yeah.
Okay, because I think, I mean, this touches in so many areas that I would like to have been speaking to, but never have, because and so thank you. I thought this was just really, really wonderful.
Yeah.
Damien, so I have a definition of dialogos. Dialogos is when the participants get to a place collectively that they couldn't get to individually. And I felt that very much in my discussion with you.
Yeah. Sure.
And so thank you very, very much.
This is the first interview I've done for the course, and I really wanted it to be with you because I had a feeling that all of this kind of stuff would come out of it, just an intuition.
Well, your intuition was very foresightful. I mean, I saved this book because he's dead now. I hadn't read it before. What is it? A Night in the Lonesome October. It's one of Zelazny's last books, and it's actually each chapter is a day in October, and it's a fantasy book, and so I'm reading it in October. But talking to you about all of this really sort of also stirred up a lot of my memories and some very cherished ones around this. And it's actually really nice that I'm reading this book and had that conversation with you. So at a very personal level, this was a very enriching conversation for me. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm really happy. It's been such a good talk. Yeah. I would, if there's like ways of talking about this more in future, I would be super interested in doing that. So
count me in. Just let me know. Count me in. This was valuable. This was good. This was enriching. And it was a pleasure speaking with you. I'd love to do this again at some point.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I'm going to let you go get about your day.
Well, thank you very much. Take good care, Damien.